Okay, so our next presenter is me. And so I'll be presenting the quantitative valuation work. It's basically based on the stuff that both Stavros and Joe had presented earlier, just then. And so what I'm going to talk about is how we measure the quality of life, in particular the PET score. And so first I'm going to give you a very quick, brief background on how we measure quality of life, the issues we need to consider when we're measuring quality of life in children, and then talk about the method that we went with, so study design, and then present some very preliminary findings. This is ongoing work, it's a work in progress, and we also want to talk about anchoring issues and just conclude with some discussions and thoughts. Okay, so background. How is quality of life measured? So when we're talking about quality of life here, we're talking about measures for quality of life or health technology assessments. So we're talking about health-related quality of life and they're preference-based. So what do I mean by preference-based? It means that the scoring or the valuing reflects the preferences of the public or people. And so when we go about measuring quality of life in this type of quality of life, the first thing we need is the health state, a way to describe the health state of a child or person. And so in our case, the PET score would be a contender for that. And then we would develop a survey, so develop a questionnaire, and the questionnaire will have some sort of preference-based or some sort of methodology that will help us discern the preferences or elicit preferences for these health state descriptions, and then we go out to respondents. Then the next stage is, once we get the data, we go through a preference-based valuation set. So we generate a preference-based valuation set, so through some statistical analysis, and have a scoring algorithm basically to help us score and provide utility values for those the health states that are described by the PET score. So that's just a sort of an overview of how we go about measuring quality of life. And so what are some of the issues or challenges that we need to think about when we're measuring quality of life in children? So the first thing is understanding the nuances of your instrument. And so in terms of the PET score, we know that this is quite an extensive instrument. It has multiple modules or versions. So we have the toddler version for ages 2 to 4, young children ages 5 to 7, we've got children ages 8 to 12, and teenagers 13 to 18. And within that, there's different versions. You've got the parent-reported versions for the toddlers and the young children. And then for children and teenagers, we've got a self-complete version and a parent-report version. And they all differ slightly in terms of the way that the wording is sort of given, and also, but they all sort of essentially describe the same sort of constructs and items. Except the toddler one has slightly less items in it. Okay, so that's one sort of consideration to make. The second, and then given all of these versions and modules, we have to think about what kind of value set do we want? Do we want just one value set, or should we be having value sets for every single version and module out there? Okay, and that's something to think about as well. Now, the second challenge we have is, who are the appropriate respondents that we should be sampling? Should we be sampling the general population, which is kind of the general way we approach in terms of health economics, because they're the general adult population, I should say, because they're the taxpayers, and we're making decisions about funding of treatments, drugs, and services. Or should it be the specific group that these instruments were intended for? So in this case, kids. So that's a consideration we need to think about. The third consideration is, what's the appropriate method in which we can elicit preferences? So there's a range of methods out there, and those appropriate methods of elicitation will also depend on our instrument. So what we decided to embark on was to measure or value the full item PET score. Remember, that's 23 items, 5 levels each, and a reduced form PET score as well. And that one had 4 domains or 4 attributes of 5 levels each. And so that would actually require different elicitation methods, because we can't do a time trade-off or a DCE with such a large number of items. And so we had to think of, so what we decided to do was actually a best West survey. best words study on that. And for the reduced form, we went ahead with the DCE. But the reasons for choosing these appropriate methods also depend on what the evidence says about these methods. So as systematic reviews and everything had shown previously, DCEs and best worst is increasingly more popular because they're generally considered to be easier to do and administer. So that's kind of where we're going in that direction. But with certain methods that you use, we also have to think about anchoring. So what do we mean by anchoring? So these scores have to be between 0 and 1, or, well, 0 needs to reflect depth and 1 reflecting full health. And so with different methods, they may need to be anchored in a way so that it has values where depth is 0 and 1 is full health. Okay, so now we talk about our study design. So as I said before, we're valuing the PEDS score, and with the PEDS score we're valuing the full item set, and we're going ahead with that using a best worst scaling method. And that was already presented to you in Joe's presentation. Basically, you're choosing best and worst out of a subset of statements, and we ask them multiple questions like this, so that effectively what we're getting across people is a relative importance across all statements. Statements being, well, we've got 115 statements because we've got 23 items, 5 levels each. So that's 115 statements. And then basically, what sample did we go to? So again, who should we sample? So what we did was we decided to sample all 3 different versions. So we've gone for children, parents on behalf of children, and the general population. Now, when we think about these 3 different samples, we also have to think about how we present or frame the task and the perspectives. And so we have 3 different perspectives. The first is the child, when they're completing it, we ask them to imagine living in those scenarios and making the choices. And for the proxy complete, so the parent completing, we ask them to imagine their child living in those scenarios and making a choice. And then in the general adult population, we ask them to imagine a typical child between ages 8 and 12. 8 and 12 in this case is just a particular PEDS module that we're looking at, and making a choice there. And in the last 2 in particular, we explicitly tell them to make the choice from the viewpoint of the child. So what would the child prefer? Okay, so here, this is just to say that we actually may look to value across all those 4 modules that I presented to you earlier. For the child completes, we got them to complete the 8 to 12 modules and the 13 to 17 module. The 8 to 12 module was valued by 10 to 12-year-olds, and as we know from Joe's presentation earlier, that was because we found that 10-year-olds could do the best worst task with relatively little error. And so that's why we went with 10 to 12-year-olds for that. And then the rest, we've got parent proxies completing the modules where there's parent proxy modules, and then the general population across all 4 modules. Okay, so then now we move on to the valuation for the reduced form DCE. And so this is for the reduced form PEDS score that Stavros had presented. And with that, what we did was we went through a DCE study. So in the DCE, it's a choice between 2 scenarios, and those scenarios are described by combinations of the reduced form PEDS score. So 4 attributes and 5 levels. We showed them multiple questions again. And basically the idea is that how often you choose something is related to how much it's valued. And so with the DCE, as Joe had mentioned, you're trading off multiple attributes. And with the DCE, it's much simpler because you're just picking what's best and what's worst, so the extreme preferences. Okay, so similar to the best worst, we're looking at 3 different samples and 3 different perspectives, and same as before. And same as before, we're going to value all of these modules. And in particular, just pointing out for the child self-complete, as Joe had presented, we could 12-year-olds can complete the DCE reasonably well, but we're not so sure about younger ones, so we're getting 12-year-olds to value the 8 to 12-year-old module of head squat. So this is the overall study design. It's not the full study design yet, because we'll still have to talk about anchoring, but at this point, this is the full study design, and what we did was we decided to sample 500 for each of these survey arms, each of the yellow boxes down there. So in total, our sample size is 8,000 respondents. At the moment, let me see where we're up to. So we decided to sample 8,000 respondents, and data was collected via an online survey, which was administered by Pew Profile, an online panel. Okay, so the online survey structure is just your standard sort of online survey structure. We have information on consent and screening questions at the start. Then we've got some instructions on how to complete the task and a practice question. Then we follow on to the actual elicitation, and then post-task questions and social demographics. The reason why I highlight the instructions on task completion, because that varied depending on the sample that we went to. So for the child completion in particular, we actually had video instructions, and the video instructions, the script, basically reflected the same ones that were tested in the qualitative interviews that we had, and also the avatar, the person that was talking, we tried to make them reflect the interviewers that we had also in the qualitative interviews, interview stage. And for the adults, we didn't give them a video. They just basically had a click-through instruction where they, instructing them on how to complete the task. Okay. One thing that we were also concerned with was with children. We were worried that they wouldn't be engaged in the survey. So then we added a lot of things into the survey. So one thing was we had like a Minecraft type background, with like clouds and green grass and everything like that, just to make the survey prettier and more interesting. The other thing was we also had an avatar selection, so they could choose like an avatar that was more similar to themselves, and they would see the avatar at certain points in the survey a little bit later on when we're asking questions about themselves, just sort of to make it a little bit more interesting for kids to do. We were also interested in sort of engagement and attention across all the samples that we went to. So we also had real-time prompting and alerts. So if people didn't spend long enough in a question, we would have an alert that says, you didn't spend that long, are you sure about your answer? And that was kind of just to make them be more deliberate in their answers. The other thing was we repeated, so the design actually had 10 sets, but we actually gave people 11 sets because one of the sets were repeated. And then basically if the answer to that set was different to what they had before, we would have a prompt that says, oh, your answer was different. Why was this? And did you change your mind? Not sure, not paying attention. So that was kind of to get them to sort of be more engaged, because in case, I guess there was lost interest midway through the survey. So, okay. So now moving on to evaluation. So we've just finished collecting data from the best worst study. Unfortunately, I still don't have the data, so I can't. So these results are actually on preliminary data, right? So I don't have the full data set, but I'll get the full data set next week, I think. But anyway, so I'm just going to present to you very briefly on what sort of the output would look like. So this graph is kind of busy, but basically what we're looking at here, the best worst survey. So if you remember, that's kind of shows you the ranking across all statements. So what we're seeing here is on the y-axis is the preferences. So preference coefficient, they're not scaled, so that number doesn't really mean much. But basically, the higher the bar, the more preference you have, and the lower the bar, the less preference. Okay. So each column or grid basically refers to an item on the PET score. So we've got all 23 items there. And the bars are sort of ordered in the way where we've got never having any problems to rarely, sometimes, and what was the other one? Often and almost always having problems on that particular item. Okay, so what you can see is that the general patterns of preferences are as expected. So what we would expect is that there'll be sort of a decrement in preferences across those problems. So that's what we're seeing. So it's sort of going down from never to almost always being a problem. And so that's good. I mean, there's some that aren't, and we'll fix that, you know, when we get the full data set. At this point, the thing so this one here is the, based on the completes from 10 to 12-year-olds, so there's a typo up there, 10 to 12-year-olds, but then valuing the 8 to 12-year-old module. And what we can see here is the item with the highest sort of preference or bar, and also just like takes up more of the utility or preference space is the one about other kids not wanting to be their friends. Okay, and what I wanted to do was sort of contrast that with how did adults sort of answer the same module. And so the next slide here, we've got the adults. Okay, what you notice is the bar is a lot higher, but then we're talking about preferences here, so this has to be rescaled. So they're not directly comparable in terms of the numbers, but again, higher preference is higher the bar. And what you see here is actually the attribute that with the greatest importance is not other kids not wanting to be my friend, but it's the one next to it, which is getting along with other kids. So what this potentially says to me, at least, is that we're probably going to see that there'll be differences in the value sets that we'll get from the adult population compared to the sort of reports of children. I don't know about the proxies or the parents yet, but we will have different values, and we'll have to figure out a way to reconcile that. And we have a work package to do that. So we'll be looking into that. So that's kind of the preliminary findings at the moment. I haven't looked at or done any analysis for any of the other data sets yet. But what I wanted to talk about now is about anchoring and why we need to anchor. So because we're using DCEs and best West scaling, these are an ordinal method, which means that it will provide us relative preferences for health states, but they're not actually on that 0 to 1 scale that I talked about, where 0 is death and 1 is perfect health. There are methods, cardinal methods like TTO and standard gamble, time trade-off and standard gamble, that will directly obtain these type of scores, but they're generally a lot more difficult for participants to complete, and particularly with kids as well, because they're just really hard to do, but also you'll also be asking them to make trade-offs with dying, and that would also be sort of something that would be not very good for kids. Now there are, so basically, because we're using ordinal methods, we need to have this additional step to anchor the scores that we come up with. And there are methods to anchor scores from a DCE. You can have a DCE and then have a separate time trade-off task, or DCE or separate standard gamble task, or have a DCE with duration as an additional attribute. Again, the duration would be duration until immediate death afterwards. And so that would not be appropriate among younger kids. Okay, so this is the same diagram you saw before, but now we're just going to focus on the bottom, which is about the anchoring. So what we've done now is basically, I'm just going to focus on the yellow box first, the one here. For the parents and the general population, to anchor the scores from the DCE, what we did was we included duration as an attribute into the DCE task. For the children, we're going to use an additional time trade-off task, but that would be valued by adults, and use that to anchor whatever we get from the DCE that we get with kids. And then for the best-worst one, we'll be looking into the health state values that are taken from mapping studies, because we're really looking at a health state that is like 23 items, which is too much to be able to use in a time trade-off or any other type of anchoring methods. Okay, so the DCE with duration, what do I mean? So the only difference here is that the first line of the scenarios, you also tell them how long they're going to live for in that particular health state. So you're going to live 15 years with the following and then die. Or 5 years with the following and then die. And as you can see, that wouldn't be great with kids. So we didn't even test that, right? So we're only doing this among proxies and the general population. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the child self-completes. So what we're doing is a separate time trade-off task with adults. And the time trade-off task will look like something like this. Basically, you would have a choice. This is just an example. You could have a choice in life A, which is described at that green bar up the top, 5 years in full health, or life B, which is 10 years in this imperfect health state, described at that blue box. And the blue box are basically described like the PEDS poll, items from the PEDS poll. And basically, what we do is we would change the number of years in life A, and when we reach to a point where the respondent feels indifferent between being in life A in that many years and 10 years in life in an impaired health state. And that will allow us to give us a value that we could use to anchor the results from our DCE. Okay, so that pretty much summarizes what we're planning to do for the valuation work. It's still ongoing, we're still collecting data. So just some thoughts at the end. So this is a study that is developing an Australian preference-based value set for the PEDS score. As this is the first to, I guess, value preferences in Australia, and we don't know any that have been done internationally either. When we're designing a valuation study for a child health measure, it's quite complex. As you can see, there's so many considerations to take account of. Evidence of the appropriate measure to value. We need to think about the structure of the instrument we're looking at. So in this case, for PEDS score, how many items there are, what are the different age modules, the different variations and versions. And then we have to think about the appropriate respondents we want to sample and the different perspectives. How many value sets do we want? And I guess our perspective has been pretty agnostic. We're doing everything, and then we're just going to give it to the decision makers and they can use whichever they feel like. The appropriate methods for the specific age groups is also a consideration to take account of. And we also, depending on the methods, we'll have to think about whether we should be anchoring or not. So the preliminary findings, just very briefly presented here, show that different samples may value quality of life differently. So the question is, how can we, if we do find that, how are we going to reconcile all of those results? And that's it from me. So, thank you. Oh gosh, we're running out of time. I talk too much. Sorry. Any quick questions? Brendan.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So yeah, it's really complex. So it's great to see what you're doing. It's just amazing. So many different arms, and yeah, it's really impressive. I had a question about the recruitment of the younger people. So obviously, your profile cannot recruit from that age group directly. Yes. So you go by the parents. So I was interested in what process you undertook to ensure that the survey was handed to the younger respondent, and whether you tested whether it's actually them doing the survey. And also whether we included any other data quality indicators apart from the box that popped up for the repeat question, because I think data quality is a big issue in online VC, online surveys in general, so I was wondering what measure you took around that.
I mean, that's a good question. We don't know if it was the actual child, and I mean, at the start we do ask the consent of both the parent and the child to complete the survey, but it could just be an adult doing it, right? We don't know that. We do, in terms of data quality, I guess like with bot detection, I guess that's something that we also have to think about. We do have hidden questions in the survey that only bots should be able to answer, and that will help us sort of narrow them down. And we did select times to when to launch the survey, so we'd be launching them after school hours and not when they're sleeping, and so we would pause the survey sort of at certain times, it's like it's midnight, the kids should be doing the survey. You know, so we did things like that. And we do, I was thinking about the question that you had mentioned, he'd asked earlier for Joe. We do add a question at the end of the survey, whether they completed the survey by themselves or with the parent there, or their parent helped it complete it, you know. So we do have that, which will help us sort of tease out that. But again, you don't know if people are truthfully answering, and do you have a suggestion?
Well, no, we looked at the time taken on the transition page.
Oh, we did. Well, what we also did was we had we went to peer profile. We said, you know, if people didn't finish, if people were speeding and finished the survey at, you know, like I don't know how many minutes it was, we won't take that data because there's a video. There's all these things in there that should actually make the survey longer. But if we've got people doing it less than 5 minutes, less than however minutes, then that wouldn't be quality data. So we told them that up front. Yeah.
Thanks. I just had a question about the duration with the DCE, because I sort of look at that and think these are children, and 5 and 10 years both seem very short durations. And to me, if you were talking about a 5 or 10 year duration, I would be automatically thinking that the health state was severe, because we wouldn't expect a child to die in 5 or 10 years. So I just wondered whether there were any longer durations included, and then I sort of had a side question for Brendan, because you said you tested in the Think Aloud with the 12-year-olds durations, and I just wondered what durations you tested.
That's a fantastic question. Brendan, do you want to answer?
No, you go first. No, I'm happy to. I think it's the choice of duration is a problem across this whole entire methodological approach. Even for adults, we don't expect to die in 10 years. So we tested, I think we tested up to around 30 years maybe. But I think that once you start doing that, you're introducing other effects around time preferences and non-linear time and issues around how people actually imagine that 30 years. So I think either way, whichever way you look at it, there's challenges in doing it.
We went with a maximum time of 10 years, but this was definitely a consideration that we had, and was sort of something that we deliberated among the group. And just what we ended up doing was looking at the sort of the literature in this area, and I think there was a study that didn't look at 20 years, but in general most of the literature looked at 10 years. And because the people that were completing the survey were adults, then the thinking was that they couldn't really imagine beyond 10 years. Some of them would be a lot older, and so then it was sort of stuck with what was kind of standard. But it was definitely a sort of a thought that we've kind of pondered on quite a bit. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks for that. All very interesting. I know this is only preliminary data, but just going back to the question right at the beginning where you have the two transposed questions, the adult responses in relation to friends and the kids' response in relation to kids. This one here.
Yes.
It's in, and I may be misinterpreting this in terms of what you were suggesting, but it seems to me that those actually might be appropriate answers for each of those groups. Not that the parents' interpretation is wrong for the kids, but the way that question is framed for me when I think about it, I think that, oh yeah, that's what I'd expect the parent to know about their kid, as opposed to what the kid is experiencing of that. And so if that's actually correct interpretations, you couldn't say,
no.
Oh, this is, we've got to use the kids.
Yes.
Best response for the kids, for the adults, because it wouldn't mean it's how you perceive that
particular
situation.
It is. I do agree. It's the perspective of the person completing it. Although we've been very explicit that that try to make that choice on behalf of that child. Like, what would that child prefer? But then we have different experiences, so it's going to be different, and it's completely valid. But then I think the problem is, once we have the value set,
it's actually seeing the same thing,
yes,
but through a different
Different
set of
lens.
eyes. So
Yeah.
how how you see it or how you express it
Yes.
is different depending on which way, who's looking at it.
Yeah, yes. So I mean, this is not a
No,
question
no,
for
it's
me.
not a question.
I mean, this is not a question for me. It will just be that we'll end up with a lot of value sets that are different, and it will be up to whoever the practitioners are that are using it to decide.
Well, looking at this questionnaire over and over again as various people present it, I'm looking and I'm thinking, why do they use that question, like the low energy question? What does that mean? I mean,
Yes.
Which I think also goes to Joe's point about the language of it for an Australian audience. And I think doing, I think allowed study actually of the whole measure might actually be really useful, because even in deciding some of those items that move forward to the shorter valuation, we had a lot of discussion about the language of the actual items and the slightly odd wording of some of them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not going to keep the word. Oh, okay. One more question.
It was more just a comment in response to Joe's question about duration. And I think one of the considerations was that because we're framing the pedagogical health states in terms of items such as school functioning being teased by the children, it's quite difficult to think about, get someone to think about, school functioning over, say, a 20 or 30-year period rather than sort of a more limited period. It seems quite different to say the duration considerations for the adult EQ5D measure, where you can be in adults EQ5D health state for, say, 30, 40 years.
But then for the younger version of EQ5D, if you have 10 years or 15 years, you move into you should be completing the older, the adult version anyway. So you've got a transition between instruments within the time frame. So there's a bit of a challenge there to.
Okay. Oh, I won't keep you away from your lunch. So, thank you.